New Orleans Hoodoo versus Delta Hoodoo, the regional divide, two traditions, one spiritual root. How geography shaped American Hoodoo into radically different but connected practices. American Hoodoo is not a single tradition, but a family of related practices that developed differently across regions, shaped by the specific mix of African ethnic groups, Native American peoples, and European settler cultures that collided in each place. The distinction between New Orleans Hoodoo and Delta Hoodoo, two of the tradition's most documented branches, illuminates the nature of Hoodoo itself through their differences and their common roots. These parallel traditions reveal how spiritual practice adapts to geography, social context, and community need, while retaining recognizable kinship with shared African origins. New Orleans Hoodoo emerges from the city's unique history as a meeting point of French, Spanish, Caribbean, and African cultures. It develops in urban contexts with close connections to Haitian Vodou, the Catholic saint system, and the French Creole culture of free people of color. This urban environment produces organized practitioners who maintain community standing, charge fees, and operate as recognized figures in New Orleans' social life. Marie Laveau represents only the most famous example of this professional class of spiritual workers who build reputations, maintain clienteles, and operate within an established market for spiritual services. Delta Hoodoo, by contrast, takes root in the Mississippi Delta's plantation culture and its aftermath. It develops in rural contexts under conditions of greater isolation, more intense suppression, and more immediate connection to raw survival under extreme social violence. The practitioners of Delta Hoodoo operate without the professional infrastructure of their New Orleans counterparts, working instead through personal relationships, inherited knowledge, and improvisation born of necessity rather than commercial opportunity. The most comprehensive documentation of this regional variation comes from Harry Middleton, Hyatt's massive research project. Between 1936 and 1940, this Episcopal priest and amateur folklorist conducts over 16 interviews in cities and towns across the South. His work produces Hoodoo, Conjuration, Witchcraft, Rootwork, published in 5 volumes between 1970 and 1978. This collection represents the primary evidence base for understanding geographic variation in American Hoodoo practice. Hyatt's systematic approach spans New Orleans, Memphis, Atlanta, Baltimore, St. Petersburg, and dozens of smaller communities. The material he collects demonstrates that while core principles remain consistent across geography, the use of spiritual power through material objects, the manipulation of crossroads energy, the propitiation of spiritual forces, the specific materials, specific entities referenced, and specific social contexts of practice vary enormously. His interviews capture practitioners and clients speaking in their own voices about their understanding of spiritual work, creating a documentary record of unparalleled depth. The documentation reveals that a New Orleans practitioner speaking in the Vodou-inflected language of LWA and Orishas operates from a different surface vocabulary than a Delta practitioner speaking in the language of the devil at the crossroads. Yet Hyatt's work reveals consistent underlying logic beneath these surface differences. The same spiritual principles express themselves through regionally distinct symbolic systems, material cultures, and social structures. Zora Neale Hurston brings a different perspective to documenting these traditions. Her fieldwork produces both Mules and Men in 1935 and Tell My Horse in 1938. Unlike Hyatt, she covers both traditions through direct participation rather than external observation. She undergoes initiation into New Orleans Hoodoo under multiple practitioners, including Luke Turner, who claims descent from Marie Laveau herself. She also travels extensively in the Delta and other rural southern areas, collecting folk material that documents the rural Hoodoo tradition from the inside. Her dual perspective, as both a trained anthropologist and an African-American woman who can access communities that white researchers cannot, gives her documentation a texture that Hyatt's more systematic but more external work lacks. She participates in the spiritual work she documents, experiencing the practices as an initiate rather than merely recording them as an observer. This insider status allows her to perceive nuances that might escape external documentation. Hurston notes specific differences between the regional traditions. New Orleans Hoodoo features elaborate altar work, extensive use of Catholic imagery, and a community of professional practitioners with established clienteles. The tradition maintains visible presence in the city's spiritual landscape, with practitioners operating from known locations and serving clients who seek them out by reputation. The work involves complex rituals, carefully prepared materials, and formal relationships between practitioner and client, mediated by fees and professional boundaries. Delta Hoodoo presents a more improvisational quality. It maintains deeper roots in Protestant Christian language, drawing from the religious vocabulary of rural Southern churches rather than Catholic symbolism. The tradition places particular emphasis on the crossroads and the personal relationship with supernatural power that bypasses any intermediary. Knowledge passes through family lines, personal apprenticeships, and direct spiritual revelation rather than through formal initiation structures. Practitioners work within their communities rather than establishing themselves as professional spiritual workers separate from other social roles. The dangerous applications of both traditions follow parallel but regionally distinct paths. New Orleans Hoodoo, with its urban professional structure, develops a relatively elaborate market for harmful work. Clients seeking to break up relationships, destroy businesses, cause illness, or visit vengeance on enemies consult professional practitioners who perform these services for fees. The documentation of such services appears in court records, newspaper accounts, and in Hyatt's interviews, where practitioners describe specific formulae and procedures for specific harmful purposes with a matter-of-fact professionalism suggesting an established market. This professional approach to harmful work creates a spiritual services economy parallel to legitimate commerce. Practitioners advertise their capabilities, build reputations for effectiveness in particular types of work, and compete for clients based on their success rates. The urban environment allows for specialization, with some practitioners focusing on particular types of cases while referring other work to colleagues with different specialties. Delta Hoodoo's harmful applications, documented in Hyatt's rural interviews and in the testimony of blues musicians, emerge more personally and more improvisationally. The rootwork done in a fit of anger or grief by someone who has learned enough to be dangerous represents one common pattern. The curse laid at a crossroads after a betrayal, the trick buried in an enemy's yard by someone who cannot afford a professional and improvises from available materials and partial knowledge. These represent Delta Hoodoo's approach to harmful work as an extension of personal conflict rather than commercial transaction. This improvised quality makes Delta Hoodoo's harmful applications potentially more unpredictable. Without the professional practitioners training in proper procedures, amateur workers risk unintended consequences, including harm rebounding on themselves. The tradition's knowledge holders warn against harmful work undertaken without proper understanding, but desperation, anger, and partial knowledge continue to motivate attempts at spiritual attack throughout the Delta's communities. Both traditions share the principle that harmful work can be removed, but removal requires identifying the specific type of harm and applying the specifically appropriate counter. A New Orleans Hoodoo practitioner addressing Delta Hoodoo-style conjure might be as lost as a contemporary physician trying to treat an illness with unfamiliar diagnostic categories. The principles remain the same, but the specific techniques are locally encoded, requiring knowledge of regional variations to effectively diagnose and treat spiritual affliction. Cross-regional consultation emerges as a solution to this problem. Hyatt's interviews document practitioners describing learning from practitioners of different regional schools, producing hybrid approaches that synthesize methods from multiple traditions. A practitioner who has traveled might combine New Orleans altar techniques with Delta Crossroads work, or integrate Catholic imagery with Protestant prayer formulas, creating personalized systems that draw from multiple regional sources. The most accomplished practitioners in both regions are typically those who have traveled and learned from multiple traditions. This mobility allows them to acquire a repertoire broad enough to address the full range of cases their communities bring to them. When a case involves work done according to unfamiliar regional methods, these well-traveled practitioners can recognize the signs and apply appropriate counters drawn from their broader knowledge base. Jim Haskins contributes to the documentation of these traditions through his research into African American folk magic and spiritual practices. His work contextualizes hoodoo within the broader history of African diaspora religions, examining how enslaved Africans and their descendants maintained spiritual autonomy under conditions of extreme oppression. His documentation emphasizes the survival strategies embedded in hoodoo practice, the ways spiritual work provided psychological and practical resistance to dehumanizing social conditions. The New Orleans versus Delta distinction reveals hoodoo as an adaptive practice rather than a static inheritance. Urban hoodoo and rural hoodoo develop different vocabularies, different procedures, and different social structures because the communities they serve have different needs, different resources, and different relationships to the dominant culture. The urban professional model serves communities with access to cash economies, literacy, and relative freedom of movement. The rural improvisational model serves communities under more intense surveillance and control, with less access to commercial infrastructure. Yet both traditions retain recognizable kinship with each other and with their African origins. The underlying spiritual logic of the tradition proves robust enough to survive radical variation in surface form. Core concepts, the power of crossroads, the spiritual properties of natural materials, the manipulation of symbolic objects to affect reality, the existence of spiritual forces that can be propitiated or commanded, persist across regional variations. This consistency within diversity demonstrates hoodoo's adaptive strength as a spiritual technology. The legacy of both branches lives in contemporary practice. New Orleans hoodoo's organized, professional, commercially oriented model influences modern spiritual practitioners and shop-based hoodoo commerce across the country. Cities throughout America now host spiritual supply shops, professional root workers, and formal teaching lineages that trace their organizational model to New Orleans precedents. The visibility and commercial viability of New Orleans hoodoo provides a template for practitioners seeking to operate openly in contemporary society. Delta hoodoo's improvisational, personally direct relationship with supernatural power lives in every person who lights a candle in a specific color, buries something at a crossroads at midnight, or carries a root bag against their body because their grandmother told them to. This folk transmission continues outside commercial and professional structures, passing through families and communities as practical knowledge rather than formal teaching. The Delta model persists wherever hoodoo remains embedded in daily life rather than separated into specialized spiritual practice. Contemporary practitioners often draw from both traditions without necessarily recognizing the distinction. A practitioner might purchase commercial spiritual supplies following the New Orleans model while employing them according to procedures learned from family members following the Delta model. This blending of regional traditions continues the adaptive process that has always characterized hoodoo practice, creating new syntheses responsive to contemporary conditions. The documentation provided by Hyatt, Hurston, and Haskins preserves knowledge of these regional variations at a moment when urbanization, migration, and social change were already transforming the communities that sustained them. Their work captures practitioners speaking about methods learned in the 19th century, providing windows into spiritual practices that might otherwise have left no record. This documentation serves contemporary practitioners seeking to understand historical methods and contemporary scholars examining the evolution of African diaspora religions. The distinction between New Orleans and Delta Hoodoo illuminates broader questions about how spiritual traditions evolve and adapt. Geography, social structure, economic conditions, and cultural context all shape spiritual practice, while core principles remain recognizable across variations. Understanding this regional diversity within American Hoodoo challenges simplistic narratives about African American spiritual practice, revealing instead a complex landscape of related but distinct traditions sharing common ancestry while diverging in response to local conditions. If you found this case compelling, subscribe to Vanishing Roads for more documented paranormal investigations from around the world. This story was created with AI assistance based on documented case files. All events reference real investigations and reported incidents.